Okay, let's unpack this. We're tackling a subject today that is, well, profoundly sensitive, and yet, according to our sources, deeply energetic.
Yeah.
We're doing a deep dive into the consequences of our final rites. Specifically, cremation, the sources often call it incineration versus traditional burial.
And what's fascinating here, right off the bat, is the unusual nature of the source material you've brought us. It's kind of split. On one hand, we have this transcript from an investigative hypnosis session. It makes some extraordinary, really specific claims about what the soul experiences, upon death and during these rites.
But then there's the other side.
Exactly. We also have critical commentary from the methodology's founder. It basically serves as a massive warning label about trusting that exact kind of data.
That dual perspective is really key here. So our mission today is kind of twofold. First, we want to extract the surprising alleged energetic effects. What happens to what these investigators call the subliminal part, the consciousness, the soul?
Right.
And second, crucially, we have to give you the framework needed to evaluate just how trustworthy this kind of specialized non-physical information actually is.
Yeah, that context is vital.
So let's not waste any time. We need to jump right into what the sources say about the immediate shock of cremation. The investigation describes this really visceral and traumatic initial reaction when the physical body is incinerated.
Yeah, it talks about the deceased's energetic body experiencing a severe, almost instantaneous contraction and intense distress.
It's often perceived in these sessions as a forced rupture, isn't it? Like a rapid, painful cutting of ties with the physical body.
That's the description. The imagery used is quite shocking, actually. It's compared to forcibly, rapidly removing something that's been deeply inserted into living flesh.
Oof, that's intense.
It is. And this brings us to the core paradox of cremation described in the sources. While the process is perceived as, traumatic and painful, almost like a kind of shock therapy, the speed is also seen as a significant advantage for the transitioning consciousness.
An advantage? How so?
Well, that rapid nature is thought to help the subliminal part pass much easier. The idea is that it severs earthly attachments, old behavioral programs, and these deeply rooted patterns much faster. Things that would normally anchor the soul to the physical realm for potentially a much longer time.
Okay, so it's like ripping off a bandage quickly. Painful, but faster healing, maybe. But if that shock is beneficial, are we suggesting that choosing burial might mean unknowingly selecting a slower, maybe more difficult transition? That sounds like a pretty serious implication.
It is a serious implication in the source material. But, and this is really important, we have to stress the crucial caveat that follows immediately in the investigation. This traumatic or difficult experience is not guaranteed. It's certainly not universal.
Oh, okay.
The entire outcome hinges on basically three main things: the person's established beliefs, their level of consciousness, and their overall life experience. It's highly personalized, like a kind of spiritual algebra, you could say.
Right, that makes sense. It's not one size fits all. The transition process feels very specific to the individual then. And the sources, they really detail how those personal beliefs act as a filter, sometimes even a trap, for the consciousness during this critical window, don't they?
They do. They offer a vivid contrast using religious programming as an example. So, if a person lived their life deeply rooted in some religious dogma that explicitly condemns cremation, they might perceive the intense heat of the process literally as the fire of Gehenna or hell. Why? Because of pre-existing guilt and fear that were implanted by those dogmas during their life. Their internal programming dictates their spiritual reality in that moment.
Wow. But so your beliefs can literally create your post-death reality, according to this source. And the flip side, what about someone who didn't have that fear?
Well, take someone who was described as completely saturated. Maybe they felt their physical body was a prison, or they suffered greatly. That person might see cremation as a moment of welcome liberation, acceptance even. Their state of mind, their belief in freedom, it instantaneously transforms the process from punishment into release.
Okay, so beliefs are paramount.
Absolutely. And that leads us to how the cremation is actually conducted. The investigation makes a distinction between mechanical or technical cremation and sacred or ritualistic cremation. Energetically speaking, the difference is apparently massive.
Okay, let's talk about the standard process most people encounter today, the technical one. What do the findings suggest about that?
Right. So if the cremation is purely mechanical, cold, rapid, often entirely technical, done without any real ritual or time for reflection, the subliminal part often feels profoundly confused, disoriented. It experiences extreme separation anxiety. It perceives itself as being forced out without warning or care.
Forced out.
Yeah. And this rapid cold process is linked in the source to what it calls a broader sort of negativistic societal push for fast technical processing of everything, including death. It reduces what's termed the necessary digestion time for the spiritual transition.
Digestion time. That's an interesting phrase. It suggests the soul actually needs a deliberate window, a moment to process and understand its new non-physical state.
Exactly. It's not just like flipping a switch. There's an adjustment period needed.
Okay, so cremation is potentially a rapid, maybe painful break. Let's shift gears now and look at traditional burial. What happens, according to these sources, when the soul is slowly subjected to the earth's, well, its energetic influences?
Yeah.
Especially for someone who wasn't highly conscious or prepared.
Right. Burial, according to this investigation, creates a much slower and often actually more difficult energetic process. The deceased remains strongly subject to what they call terrene energetic influences. Earthly energies, think of them like heavyweights. So for a person with many attachments, unresolved issues, or strong materialism, the investigation suggests their programs and problems are essentially ruminated upon, chewed over, for a very long time.
Can you give us maybe a more concrete analogy for that? How does earthly energy actually trap a soul, according to this?
Okay. Think of it maybe like a spaceship trying to escape Earth's orbit. If you have intense gravity, that's the attachments, and you don't use enough fuel, that's consciousness or lucidity, you just never achieve escape velocity.
Ah, I see.
The Earth's energy, the terrene influence, it keeps the person kind of bound in this loop. Tethered to the physical realm, they might constantly revisit past problems, past traumas, and this makes them vulnerable, potentially, to outside energetic attacks or influences that might benefit from keeping that consciousness focused on the material world.
So burial slows down the necessary breaking of those links. It extends the soul's difficulty in moving on and potentially keeps them accessible to interference. How does this factor into the next big step, which is often considered to be reincarnation?
Well, classical burial, by its very nature of keeping that connection strong, is seen as implying an unconscious desire to continue earthly experiences. It maintains strong bodily attachments, pulling the individual back towards the physical quite strongly.
Yeah.
Cremation, on the other hand, is seen as beneficial in this context because the fire is believed to partially burn or thin out some of those energetic links. It makes the transition faster, maybe cleaner, clearing away some of the minor day-to-day detritus.
And the investigation was very specific about this. Cremation only helps with the links, right? It doesn't solve the big karmic problem.
That's the absolutely critical distinction.
Yes.
The sources are crystal clear on this point. Cremation does not absolve a person of major karmic consequences established during life. If you accrued significant karmic debt, well, that debt remains. The fire merely provides a kind of energetic advantage in the separation process itself, mainly by dissolving the less critical everyday attachments.
Okay, now here's where the investigation takes a, let's say, highly speculative turn. It moves into the metaphysical landscape, exploring the alleged origins of cremation. And the claims are, well, they're pretty shocking. They are quite startling. The sources suggest that in ancient times, the practice might have been induced not for spiritual liberation at all, but as offerings or sacrifices, sometimes even of living beings.
Sacrifices to whom?
To visible lower vibration entities is the claim. And the mechanism detailed in the source is this. The ash, containing particles of the person's DNA, was perceived to somehow maintain the subliminal part captive within the entity's energetic field.
Wow.
It suggests this was a practice actively transmitted from the metaphysical realm, specifically designed to capture and control human consciousness after death.
That's a truly dark origin story. But also, it sounds incredibly speculative. How does an investigation claim to verify something like that, ancient history, through a contemporary hypnosis session? Doesn't that immediately raise a massive red flag about the contamination issue we need to discuss? It absolutely does. And the sources themselves, or at least the commentary around them, acknowledge that risk. The investigators would say they look for patterns that recur across many, many sessions. But yes, the primary concern is that this kind of ancient history is itself highly likely to be contaminated data. We have to report what the sources claim, though, which is that while this darker practice might have existed, the ritual was later sort of co-opted by certain ascetics or monks.
Right, who adopted it with a completely different intention.
Precisely. Their goal was apparently to use the act to actively break the cycle of reincarnation, a conscious rejection of the physical body. Though, as we've already established, the source reiterates cremation only assists. It doesn't magically do the work for you.
Okay, let's bring this back to the individual transition. What happens if the deceased person was already, say, interfered with by entities or even extraterrestrials during their life? What role does the choice of final rite play then?
This is another key point in the investigation. The interference, which by its nature tends to reduce a person's spiritual lucidity and decision-making power, may have actively induced the person to choose cremation while they were still alive.
Induced them. Why?
Entities might encourage this choice, the source suggests, because the resulting rapid, disorienting shock of cremation makes the subliminal part an easier target.
Easier target because it's confused and distressed.
Exactly. When the soul is confused, disoriented, experiencing that trauma, it's less discerning. It becomes more vulnerable, less able to see through sophisticated energetic traps. Things like holograms or entity deceptions, imposters posing as deceased loved ones, or spiritual guides who seem to come to meet them on the other side. They can be easily led astray in that state.
Okay. Wow. We've covered some really highly specific, incredible, and frankly, often quite dark claims from these hypnotic sessions. For you listening, we've gone from talking about burial plots to entities inducing cremation choices. So now we have to stop and ask the big question. How do we reconcile these extraordinary claims with where they're coming from? What does this all actually mean for us in terms of practical knowledge?
Right. And this is the crucial pivot point. This is where we introduce the critical commentary from the methodology itself. Everything we've discussed so far, all these details, they come from this one specific type of investigation. We must apply extreme scrutiny to this data. We need to understand the contamination problem.
Let's break that down. What is the contamination problem, simply put?
Well, the source material, particularly the commentary by Grifasi himself, is very, very clear on this. Information received in a single hypnotic session is highly contaminated, massively so. Think of it less like talking underwater and more like a vastly complex game of telephone played across different dimensions and consciousness filters. The original signal, whatever it is, travels through various densities through the consciousness of the person under hypnosis, and then it passes through the operator's or investigator's own mental structure, their beliefs, their culture, their interpretations.
The investigation used a great analogy for this, didn't it? About body language.
Yes, the example given is trying to interpret body language, specifically the yes-no head movements, across different cultures where those gestures might be reversed, nodding for no or shaking for yes. The potential for misinterpretation is astronomical.
Right.
So if an operator perceives a subtle energetic movement and their mind interprets it as, say, an affirmation, but in that subtle culture it actually means the opposite, well, that tiny misinterpretation can cascade into an entirely false conclusion about someone's karmic state or their history or anything else. That's the contamination mechanism in action.
And the reliability solution they offered. It's kind of staggering when you hear it.
It is genuinely sobering. The commentary states quite bluntly that a single session is essentially useless for genuine investigation. Reliable information, which they estimate is a tiny fraction, perhaps only 2 to 3% of all the data received, is only extracted by compiling thousands of sessions from different people, different operators all over the world. And then you look for the identical common data point that appears consistently again and again.
2 to 3%. That implies that 97 or 98% of the specific, highly detailed information we've just been discussing, the descriptions of rupture, the entity interference, the ancient origins, would be considered potentially garbage or noise by the very people conducting the inquiry.
That's the stated context, yes. It radically reframes how we have to view this data. The purpose of using single-session data, therefore, isn't really to offer proof of some objective reality. It's more like a vehicle, a way to focus attention on a particular problem or theme that might be relevant to the client or the research question. We have to respect the complexity and the profound level of contamination inherent in any data derived from these subtle realms.
Okay, so let's try to connect these threads now. We have these detailed claims on one side and this massive caveat about reliability on the other. Is there anything that sort of rises above the noise? Regardless of whether the specific energetic details are 2% reliable or 100% reliable, what's the most potent finding that seems to run through the entire inquiry?
I think the point that seems to transcend the contamination concerns, the ultimate core takeaway, is the absolute necessity of lucidity. Consciousness. Awareness.
Okay.
The final conclusion drawn in the inquiry seems to be that the best choice, whether it ends up being cremation or burial, is a conscious decision. One based on deep knowledge, self-awareness, and discernment. not one based on fear, blind tradition, or externally induced pressure.
Like that societal myth you mentioned earlier about no space left in cemeteries, the sources suggested that's often used as a kind of fear tactic, maybe a form of subjugation, designed to push people towards the more technical, non-ritualized cremation process.
Exactly. The external pressure is designed to influence the decision away from conscious choice. But ultimately, whether you choose burial or cremation, the core mechanism that determines the soul's subsequent path, according to this view, depends almost entirely on the deceased's internal state. The strength of their intrinsic values, their level of consciousness, their internal freedom that acts as the most powerful form of spiritual protection against any negative outside influences.
That puts the power and the responsibility firmly back on the individual's inner work during life.
Precisely.
And there was one final, brief, but important note on grieving that the investigation added wasn't there.
Yes, just a small point. Natural sorrow, or even genuine joy if it's rooted in real affection for the person, is actually seen as beneficial to the deceased's transition. It's accepted. But exacerbated, prolonged, dramatic non-acceptance of the death, that's seen as detrimental. It creates a kind of energetic anchor that holds the subliminal part back, prolonging the potentially painful separation process for them.
Right. So letting go in a healthy way helps them move on.
That's the idea.
Okay, so let's summarize the 2 key tracks for you, the listener, from this deep dive. First, you have the specific, alleged, energetic pros and cons of cremation versus burial, as explored in these investigations of the subtle realm, the speed versus the slowness, the attachments, the potential interferences.
And second, perhaps even more importantly, you have this intense level of critical filtering that's required to place any real trust in any data gathered from that non-physical realm. That 2-3% figure is a stark reminder.
Absolutely. Which brings us to a final provocative thought to leave you with. Given this extreme contamination rate of information claimed to come from subtle realms, that tiny 2-3% reliability index, how many of the core spiritual dogmas and beliefs we hold dear today, the ones that often dictate our final choices for ourselves and our loved ones, how much of that might be based on that minute fraction of potential truth versus just generations of cultural overlay and perhaps energetic contamination? Something for you to mull over or maybe explore on your own.